The Phantom Woman. From the moment he saw her, Gilbert Dent was completely captivated. She wasn't young or particularly beautiful, as far as he could tell, but she was mysterious. That was the key. She was captivating, even though she didn't seem to try. Every evening, as the sun set, he saw her face at the window, her eyes looking out sadly through dusty panes. He felt hypnotized by her. Night after night, he saw her in the fading light, and he started to wait all day, anxiously anticipating dusk, just to see her for a moment. She always sat at the same window on the ground floor, just watching. He imagined she was looking at him. He even thought he saw a hint of a smile on her lips once. Their eyes always met, like they were silently saying hello. This silent romance went on for months. Gilbert told himself that nothing in life stays the same forever, and he tried to figure out a way to approach her. He had just started to make a plan when something shocking happened. One evening, she wasn't at the window. The next morning, he walked down Wood Lane on his way to work. He always took the train, but he didn't want to go through another day without seeing her. His heart raced like a schoolgirl's as he got closer to her house. What if she was at the window? He almost decided to be brave, knock on her door, and tell her how she had suddenly become the most important person in his life. It didn't seem crazy to him. He hadn't even considered that she might be married or have a family. But she wasn't there, and the house felt strangely quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. It was a very hot day in late August. He watched for a long time, but no face appeared, and the house was still. He continued on his way, feeling like he had been hit in the head and was seeing stars. That afternoon, he left work early, and within an hour, he was back at the gate. The window was empty. He pushed the gate open, it was hanging loose on one hinge, and walked up the path to the door. There were 5 steps leading up to it. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at the window. He felt strangely afraid to look through the small panes, but he couldn't say why. Finally, he found the courage to look. Inside, he saw a small round table set just below the window. A work table. It was one of those tables with lots of small compartments around the edge and a lid in the middle that covered a well-shaped hole for holding needlework. He remembered his mother had one 30 years ago. A small, delicate hand was gripping the edge of the table. Gilbert Dent's eyes moved from the bloodless hand and slender wrist to a shoulder beneath a rough, simple bodice, to a thin neck, bare and thrown back. So this was the end before the beginning. He saw her. She was dead, twisted on the floor, her face turned up towards the ceiling, her stiff fingers clutching the work table in a desperate grip. He stumbled back down the path and into the lane. For a long time, he couldn't believe the horror of what he had seen. The eerie feeling of the abandoned house hung over him. Nothing felt real. It was already dark when he left the gate and walked towards the nearest police station. He was certain she was dead. This woman whose name he didn't even know, but who had had such a powerful influence on him. One look at her face would have convinced anyone. He suspected she had been murdered. He hadn't seen any blood, and there were no marks on her long, bare neck. But the word murder echoed in his ears. Later, he went back with a police officer. They broke into the house and entered the room. It was pitch black, of course. Dent, trembling, struck a match. It flared up, illuminating the walls for a moment before falling to the dusty floor. The policeman lit his lantern and pointed it towards the window. He wasn't wasting any time. He was eager to get to the bottom of this. He was excited. This promised to be a mystery with a twist. He shone the light directly on the window, and then he let out a strange, strangled cry. a mixture of anger and fear. He walked over to Gilbert Dent, who stood in the middle of the room, his hands covering his eyes, and put his hand on his shoulder, shaking him roughly. "There's nobody here," he said. Dent looked wildly at the window. The recess was empty except for the work table. The woman was gone. They searched the house and the garden. Everything was normal, but everything told the same sad story of abandonment, death, and many years of emptiness. But they didn't find any woman or any sign of one. "This house," said the policeman, looking suspiciously at the lawyer, "has been empty for longer than I can remember. Nobody wants to live here. People say there was some foul play many years ago, but I don't know about that. All I know is that the landlord can't sell it." It was doubtful if Gilbert Dent heard a word of what the policeman said. He was too stunned to do anything but creep home when they finally let him go and let himself quietly into his own house with a key. He was even afraid of himself. He didn't go to bed that night. As for the mystery of the woman, the case was dropped. It was over, officially. There was a shrug and a smirk at the police station. The assumption was that the lawyer had been drinking, that the dead woman in the empty room was a horrifying product of his drunken imagination. A week or so later, Dent visited his brother Ned, the only relative he had. Ned was a doctor. Maybe he was a little more practical than Gilbert. Anyway, when Gilbert told him about the house and the woman, Ned said it was simply a problem with his liver. "You're working too hard," his older brother said, looking at Gilbert's pale face. "It's not unusual for people to see things when they're overworked. Haven't you heard of people having their own ghosts?" "But this was a real woman," Gilbert said. Well, I was in love with her. I had decided to marry her, if I could." Ned gave him a sharp, quick look. "We're going to Brighton tomorrow," he said firmly. "You have to forget about work. You're completely exhausted. You should have been taking care of yourself." They went to Brighton, and it really seemed like Ned was right. It appeared that the woman at the window was simply a product of Gilbert's nerves. It seemed that way for about 3 weeks, and then the climax came. It was in the twilight, she had always been a part of it, that Gilbert Dent saw her again, the woman he had found lying dead. The two brothers were walking along the cliffs. The wind was blowing in their faces. The sea roared beneath the cliffs. Ned had just said that it was time they went back to the hotel for dinner, when Gilbert, with a cry, ran towards the edge of the grassy path where they were walking. He moved so suddenly that his brother barely caught him in time. They struggled on the edge of the cliff for a second. Gilbert, in a frenzy, seemed determined to jump, but Ned finally pulled him back, and they tumbled together onto the thick grass. Gilbert opened his eyes and tried to stand. "Feeling better?" asked his brother, cheerfully, offering a hand. "Strange. The sea does that to some people. I didn't think you were one of them." "What effect?" "Vertigo, my dear fellow." "Ned," said Gilbert seriously, "I saw her. It's no use trying to explain anything. I've been thinking that you were right, that she, the woman at the window, was just in my mind, that I had fallen in love with something I made up. But I saw her again tonight. You must have seen her too. She was right next to you. Why didn't you try to save her? It was practically murder to let her fall like that. I did my best." "You certainly did your best, to kill us both," said Ned grimly. Gilbert looked at him wildly. After lunch, Ned persuaded him to rest. He watched him fall asleep, then went out. When he got back to the hotel, a waiter told him that Gilbert had left about 15 minutes after Ned had gone out. He immediately feared the worst, although he wasn't sure what the worst could be. He knew he had to follow him immediately, but the next train wasn't for an hour, and it was a slow train. It was already getting dark when he arrived. He was sure Gilbert would go there. He reached the end of the lane and walked slowly, looking at each house. It wouldn't be difficult to recognize the one he wanted. Gilbert had described it in detail many times. He stood outside the loose gate and stared at the run-down stucco front and overgrown garden. He walked down a flight of steps to the back door and, finding it unlocked, stepped into a stone hallway. He had avoided the front door because he was afraid to go in, and now he was also afraid to climb the long flight of stone stairs leading up from the servants' quarters. But he forced himself to go up to the room. It was completely dark inside. He heard something scurrying across the floor. He felt years of dirt and dust under his feet. He struck a match, just like Gilbert had done, and looked at the recess where the window was. The match flared up, giving him a glimpse of his surroundings. He saw the stripes of faded wallpaper moving slightly, like the tentacles of a sea monster. He saw a creature. It looked like a rat, running across the floor from the window to the large white marble fireplace. If that's all he had seen. He saw everything the first match had shown him. He saw his brother lying on the floor. In a horrifying coincidence, his hand was caught on the edge of the work table, just like the woman's had been. His other hand was clenched across his chest. His face was contorted in pain. A dead face, of course. This was the end. He was lying dead by the window where the woman had sat every night at dusk and smiled at him. The second match went out. The doctor struck a third. He looked again, more closely. Then he staggered to his feet and screamed. The sound echoed through the empty rooms and down the long stone hallways in the basement. Gilbert's head was thrown back. His chin pointed towards the ceiling. On his throat were deep marks. The doctor could see them clearly. He saw the grip of small fingers, the distinct impression of a woman's hand. The strangest thing about the whole story, the most curious thing perhaps, is that no one else ever saw those marks. There was no scandal, no pursuit of the murderer, no unsolved crime. They faded. When the doctor saw his brother again in daylight, and with others present, his throat was clear. And the autopsy showed that his death was due to natural causes. So the matter stands, and will. But where the house and its overgrown garden stood, there is now a new road with neat red and white houses. Whatever secrets the house held, if any, it kept them quietly. Ned Dent is sometimes haunted enough to walk down the smart new road in the twilight and wonder. The end. If you like the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.